Our next speaker is an assistant professor of American culture, Latino studies, and screen arts and cultures at the University of Michigan. He is one of the 4 people here who have been or are an arts project coordinator at the Chicano Studies Research Center. We're only missing one, who Ruben mentioned, Jennifer Sternad. And he is someone who has a first name and a last name, but has mostly been known, thanks to me, probably as the Gunckel. So we asked the Gunckel to respond to a phrase by Carlos Almaraz that's in many ways guided some of our thinking, which is his statement that it is the artist's function to act like a camera for society. So we'll bring up the Gunckel.
Thank you, Chong, for that introduction, and thanks to the Chicano Studies Research Center for having me out. Actually, Chong kind of ruined my life in Michigan as well. He had a speaking engagement there and convinced all the faculty and my students actually to start calling me the Gunckel. So instead of referring to me as Professor or Dr. Gunckel, I am quite simply known now on a nationwide basis. South and North as the Gunckel, so thank you, I have to thank you for that. So by way of introducing the short films that we're about to see, I wanted to responding to this quote by Carlos Almaraz. It is the artist's function to act like a camera for society. But the title of this talk and this quote might at first glance seem like a self-evident proposal that artists working within the Chicano movement function as a camera in a rather intuitive or commonsensical way to record and document reality through their artwork or to reveal something about it in the process, with the implication that such an act serves a social or political function. Chicano artwork from the movement, however, reveals that the relationship between artistic practice and the concept of documentation during the period is a decidedly complex one indeed. Not coincidentally, in speaking about the artwork of the Chicano movement, we might approach photography simultaneously as a metaphor, a tool of documentation, and an artistic practice. We can then unpack Almaraz's statement through the 3 distinct yet related lenses that we'll talk about, these ideas that will kind of guide the talk. Art as documentation, documentation as art, and documentation as artistic process. So to begin with, art as documentation, drawing from Almaraz's quote, to act like a camera. As with any cultural product, all artwork functions in retrospect as a document of the time and the place in which it was produced. However, the documentary value or impetus within Chicano art is not merely the product of historical distance. Rather, it is often an implicit tendency within the orientation and or subject matter of the Chicano movement itself. So take, for instance, this mural by Los Streetscapers, and I think this is featured prominently in the film that we're about to see, the Chicano Time Trip, a work that demonstrates this photographic and or documentary impulse while articulating the dynamic interplay between past, present, and future. 4 of the panels depict imagery drawn from Mexican history, from pre-conquest to revolution. And at least one of the images is based directly on the photograph itself, the famous Adelita photograph from the Casa Sola archive from the revolution. At the center of the 5th panel is a contemporary Chicano family posing as if for a portrait. Surrounding them are what we might read as snapshots of their daily lives, and by implication, the broader Chicano experience. In this way, the mural functions as a sort of public photo album of the Chicano family writ large. In transforming urban space as artwork, the mural also serves as a document of a sense of place, community, and identity at a particular moment in time. Of course, it functions as much more than an artistically rendered photograph or a document in a literal sense, but it also proposes a relationship between a fluid temporality and Chicano identity. If this particular time trip revisits historical antecedents and moments of the present, frozen in time by the muralists/photographers, it does so by representing an archive of imagery upon which the future will be built. As the inscription at the top reads, quote, "Our heritage is the foundation of our destiny. The powers of our desires and imagination will determine the future." Significantly, one of these snapshots in this particular panel captures the streetscapers themselves in the process of painting a mural. It's not very legible in this particular slide, but I'll show you where it is. It's right there. So if you visit other reproductions, you might be able to see it a little more clearly. In a very basic sense, the muralists are situating public art production as a crucial part of the Chicano experience and, as implied by the inscription on the mural, a component of the foundation of the future via an ongoing transformation, reshaping, and reclamation of public space in the present. Furthermore, those streetscapers use the art of muralism to document their own artistic practice and process of muralism in a kind of reflexive feedback loop. Crucially, this mobilization of photography and documentation by the muralist is not arbitrary, but points to a broader tendency within Chicano art of the movement and the role of photography during this period, which leads us to our next concept. Documentation as art, or of art, to act with the camera. Of course, situating Chicano art within an exclusively documentary or social function presents the risk that it be reduced to this function, that its primary value lies not in its aesthetic, conceptual, or technical qualities, but instead in its status as historic or sociological evidence. For instance, an illustration of Chicano political activism or identity, or as the visual traces of the Chicano movement. Naturally, emphasizing the documentary at the expense of the aesthetic and conceptual, or proposing a strict division between the two, reproduces a logic by which Chicano art has typically been excluded from mainstream art history and institutions. Instead, much early Chicano art, by situating art as documentation, and vice versa, self-consciously challenged the boundary between these two terms. In the same way it challenged the boundaries between folk and fine art, highbrow and lowbrow, between artistic practice and community activism. In this instance, the blurring of the boundary between art and documentation constitutes another instance of Chicano art's intervention in the conception and redefinition of artistic practice itself. Oscar Castillo's photography is a key example of this dynamic interplay. Through his work, we might understand the photographer working with the camera as both a documentarian and an artist, and indeed, Oscar Castillo has described his own work in precisely such terms. Perhaps appropriately, it is this artist's documentation of early Chicano artwork itself that reveals a complex interplay between these categories. His digital photographic archive, housed at UCLA's Chicano Studies Research Center, thousands and thousands of amazing images from the 60s to the present, includes extensive documentation of Chicano cultural events and art production in Los Angeles, concerts, art openings, murals, graffiti, easel painting, television productions, and cultural festivals. While Castillo's work constitutes perhaps one of the most significant bodies of Chicano art documentation currently available, his photography transcends documentation by adopting the ethos of the artwork he shot. More specifically, as a photographer of art, he was often just as interested in process, environment, and context as he was the finished artwork itself. If, as Elise Mazadiego argues in a forthcoming anthology about Oscar Castillo, edited by Colin Gunckel, Castillo, quote, told a story about a subject through its context, end quote. We might extend this to his documentation of Chicano art. Rarely did Castillo photograph a work in isolation or as a finished product. But as in the case of muralism, he captured its production, often in collaboration with the community, its relation to its surroundings, and its status as public art with which people interacted. Here again we have the Judith Hernandez mural referenced by Sandra, I believe. This sort of framing is particularly significant in the instance of early Chicano art, because murals, to cite just one example, were conceived of as more than static or stable art objects. Instead, the process itself often held a value equal to that of the finished product. As a public community-based art practice, Chicano muralism integrated community involvement and/or consultation, and was intended in some cases to create community or to sustain an ongoing relation or dialogue among the community. In this sense, Castillo's documentation of mural production coincides with the impetus of muralism itself. Context, process, and relation are at the center of his work. Just as importantly, it is through his photography that we're able to fully grasp Chicano muralism as a community and process-based medium in all its complexity. In this way, one might argue that the photography of individuals like Castillo functions in a manner analogous to, but distinct from, the documentation of performance art that Rita just referenced. In this respect, the documentary camera affirms the foundational position of Chicano art that Chicano art deserves in the histories of community-based practice, new public art, site-specific art, relational dialogical art, and process-based art practice. Our third category, by which we might think of the relationship between photography and art and documentation. Oh, another mural by Mugu here. Is documentation as artistic process or to process the photos? While troubling the boundaries between art and documentation, it should also be mentioned that documentation also served as part of an artistic process for artists during the Chicano movement. Most notably, for artists associated with Los Four and the magazine Consapos, documentation of barrio aesthetics was integral to their artistic practice. In an effort to define and develop a truly Chicano mode of expression across media, Los Four and artists working with Consapos looked to the vernacular expressions of the barrio as a foundation of an artistic practice, things like lowriders, graffiti, cholo fashion, and yard art. The staff of Consapos in particular saw the barrio as offering a range of unique grassroots cultural material from which to build an identifiably Chicano aesthetic. Photography also played a significant role in the artistic philosophy of the Consapos group. Castillo's images, for instance, appeared in multiple issues as part of the project of locating aesthetic inspiration in the barrio. One key to understanding photography relative to Consapos, and by implication Los Four, is through the essay El Arte del Chicano by Gilbert Magus Sanchez Dujan. Magu, who was also a member of Los Four, wrote this essay, writing, quote, the Chicano has always been involved in a cultural process that can properly be looked on as art, end quote. Citing, quote, sculptured ramplas, the calligraphy of wall writings, graffiti, the gardens of our abuelos, end quote. He adds that, quote, Chicano artists are already reevaluating these common cultural elements and transforming them into a visible and tangible art forms. Aside from the immediate use of a photograph to illustrate the essay on the same page, Magua directs our attention to the following pages, which depict, quote, some examples of the Chicano visual experience. These may be considered valid artistic sources on which the Chicano artist should elaborate, end quote. One of these pages is filled with a dense collage of barrio source material, photographs of a brown beret, Cesar Chavez, children, lowriders, mercado shells, graffiti, cans of mole, and El Pato salsa, the most potent source of artistic inspiration of all. This primarily photographic arrangement, including drawings of a syringe, a raised fist, and a gang tattoo, are also included here. Here we have the visual equivalent of Magu's written statement. In the context of Consapos, photography as documentation is situated as central to accumulating an archive of vernacular Chicano expression as source material and inspiration for artists. This process of exploration and appropriation of working class barrio aesthetics in Consapos and among the group known as Los Four is also a key example of Chicano art's embrace of a Rascuache sensibility. As Tomas Ibarra Frausto has famously explained, Chicano artists, quote, investigated the Rascuache modality by turning inward to explore, decipher, and interpret elements from a Chicano cultural matrix, end quote. Rascuachismo, consequently, might be understood both as a common cultural resource and as a prevalent strategy embraced by the artists of the Chicano movement. Placed in this context, these artists engage in a conscious, concerted effort to craft an aesthetic derived from the barrio. We might then understand Rascuachismo as both an aesthetic tendency and a dynamic process of documentation, sometimes via photography, collection, translation, and transformation of vernacular culture by artists. And obviously, one of the key inspirations is for Los Four in particular is the graffiti that they saw on the walls of places like East LA, and the way they would rework this into their own aesthetic. And you see affinities between something like an Oscar Castillo photograph, one of his studies of graffiti, in which he's looking at a wall layer with different layers of graffiti, in a way, framed in a way that kind of allows it to approach abstract expressionism in these kind of studies, a series of studies of graffiti that he was doing, but then has this affinity with the way that Los Four, kind of a dark slide, Los Four would then kind of apply graffiti and kind of take that aesthetic and apply that to their exhibition design in a way kind of similar to that. So you see the affinities. So if artists of the Chicano movement indeed acted like a camera pointed at society, as Carlos Almaraz suggests, the implications of this are complex and varied. The fact that we have artists pointing their cameras at artwork that itself incorporated a figurative photographic function or process, while that sounds like a convoluted statement, instead suggests the inseparability of artistic practice and documentation within some of this work, and the complex ways in which Chicano artists were navigating the social and political with the aesthetic. So, without further ado, let's watch our films. Thank you.